10 years without a man, the Apache tribe was searching for the true and brave man, and that was him.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The way station stood where the old mail road bent along a ridge of sandstone, its walls silvered from years of wind and dust. No fresh tracks showed on the road. The last coach had come through years back when the Army still kept patrols out here. Now the building belonged to no one but James Cutter, a man who wanted it that way. He had been up since before dawn, splitting the last lengths of cedar by the chopping block, stacking them in a neat row under the lean-to. His right leg ached from the cold, an old bullet wound that never healed clean, but he worked slow and steady, jaw set, shirt damp across his back. When the axe blade stuck, he set a boot to the block, pried it free, and laid the handle down careful, as if the tool were something living. James was 38, tall but drawn tight from hard years. His hair was black with a scatter of gray at the temples, uneven where he'd cut it himself. A scar rode his jaw and disappeared under 2 days' stubble. His hands were large, the skin cracked and burned dark from sun, the fingers nicked from rope and steel. He wore what was left of his cavalry coat over a faded work shirt, a gun belt slung low out of habit. A man didn't last out here without a rifle and a pistol, but James hated the weight of them. He carried both anyway. He poured water from the barrel into a blackened coffee pot, set it on the iron stove inside the station, and stood in the doorway while it heated. The wind came down off the mesas, sharp as a blade. It pulled at the hem of his coat and stung his face with grit. He looked out across the valley floor, saw nothing but rock and dry brush, a long stretch of emptiness broken by the narrow slash of a wash below. James told himself the same thing he told himself every morning. Stay put, stay quiet, and trouble will pass you by. He had left trouble behind 10 years ago when the war ended and the scouts were disbanded. Left it behind when he turned his back on killing and rode west to find a corner the world had forgotten. This was that corner, a boarded-up way station with a leaky roof and a ridge of stone at its back. It was enough, or it had been, until the sound came. At first, it was nothing more than grit sliding on rock. Then a sharp clack like stone knocked loose and a pause that didn't fit the rhythm of wind. James moved his hand to the rifle that leaned against the door frame, lifted it without hurry, and stepped out to the edge of the ridge. Below, the wash twisted between walls of rust-colored stone. Shadows pooled in the cuts where the sun couldn't reach. James crouched, breathing slow, eyes sweeping for movement. He saw it after a long minute. 3 shapes bent under bundles, a fourth carrying something slung against her hip. Women, barefoot, Apache by the braid of their hair and the long swing of their worn deer hide skirts. The smallest figure on the rear was young and straight-backed, a turquoise pendant at her throat catching light when the wind pushed her braid over her shoulder. James stayed still, the rifle balanced across his knees. He watched them move, slow, careful, as if expecting harm from any shadow. They were thin, but not broken. Proud. He counted the bundles. Food, maybe hides. People carrying their lives in strips of sinew and cloth. He felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He knew what it meant for them to be here. How far they must have come, what they must have lost. They saw him then. All 4 froze mid-step. The older one shifted the child higher on her hip, her eyes black and steady on his. The younger stood behind, not shrinking, just waiting. James felt the weight of their stare and knew what they saw. A white man with a rifle in hand, army coat on his back, another mouth they could not trust. His thumb rested near the safety, but he eased it back, lowered the barrel until it pointed at dust. "Water up top," he said. His voice sounded rough in his own ears and used for days. "If you need it." No answer. The older woman turned first, spoke low to the others. They slid off the path into a split of rock, gone in seconds like smoke drawn through cracks. James stayed crouched long after they vanished, the rifle heavy across his knees. A part of him wanted to call after them, to say he wasn't like the others. But what good were words? Words didn't feed a hungry belly or bring back the men their people had lost. He let the silence close in again, though it didn't feel the same as before. When he stood, his knee throbbed hard enough to make his jaw clench. He limped back to the doorway, leaned the rifle against the frame, and poured the coffee. The bitter smell filled the single room as he sat on the edge of the step and drank, eyes fixed on the cut in the rock where they'd disappeared. He told himself they were gone and would not return. Told himself it was better that way. But deep down, he knew the land didn't give anyone the luxury of staying separate for long. Not out here. The wind held a dry edge the next morning, rolling down from the mesas with a sharp hiss through the cedar brush. James Cutter woke before the sun, the old habit still rooted deep. He boiled coffee on the black stove and ate what was left of yesterday's biscuit, chewing slow while the sky in the east went from iron gray to a dull gold. Nothing moved beyond the ridge, except a thin line of smoke lifting from somewhere far south. He stepped out to check the snares he'd set the evening before, rifle slung under one arm, the limp worse today from the cold biting through the scar at his leg. Every sound felt louder than it should. The crunch of his boots on gravel, the low clink of the rifle sling, because his mind kept circling back to what he'd seen yesterday. For women crossing the wash, thin as fence rails, carrying more weight than their backs should bear. He had tried to put out of his head. Failed. Questions had crawled in during the night. Why were they moving in open ground? Where was their camp? And if they were near, who else was near? When he bent to lift a sprung snare and found it empty, a sharp metallic ring carried up from the canyon, faint but real. A bell. Not his. James froze, breath misting in the cold, every muscle going tight. The only bells out here were the ones tied to horses or the warning tins he had strung on brush at the lower pass months ago. Someone had touched one. He left the snare hanging and moved fast down the wash trail, boots skidding on loose shale, the pain in his knee biting hard, but he pushed through it. At the edge of a low cut, he dropped flat and slid to a spot where he could see the bend of the canyon mouth. Tracks cut deep in the dust there, fresh, sharp-edged, heavy boots with heel plates. 5, maybe 6 sets. And farther in, by the split in the rock, he saw the first horse. Then 2 more. Men. They were dismounted, voices carrying in short bursts. James listened hard, every word a weight. Talk of moving them quick, of splitting the load, of cash easy if they don't fight. He didn't need the rest. The women he'd seen yesterday weren't the only ones out here. Maybe there was a whole camp tucked in that canyon, hiding from every raid, every lawman who thought he could trade people like freight. James pulled back slow, jaw locked so tight it hurt. He could leave. It wasn't his fight. He had told himself that same thing 100 times before, and most days it was true. But the sound of that child yesterday, the small cough as the older woman shifted her weight, clung in his head like a thorn. Those men down there would drag women and kids out by their hair if they felt like it. Sell them. Break them. And no one would stop it because no one cared, not this far west. He eased up to one knee, scanned the ridges. He had cover if he moved quick. 3 rock shelves and a juniper stand before the lip of the canyon. His rifle carried 5 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. 6 shots against 6 men. His odds were worse than bad if it turned loud. But he wasn't aiming for a gunfight. Not yet. Sliding back through the shale, James climbed the cut to the shelf where the old freight trail curved along the drop. From there he could see the men clear. Ragged coats, pistols low on their hips. One with a Henry rifle leaned against a pack horse. Their faces were turned toward the split in the rock that likely led straight to the women's hiding place. James set his rifle across a flat stone, thumbed the hammer back, and drew a slow breath. He lined the sight on the nearest slab of red rock. Not the men, not yet, and squeezed off a shot. The crack tore the morning open, echo hammering off the canyon walls. Dust burst from a stone 2 feet over their heads, sharp chips scattering like hail. Horses screamed and reared, one man diving for his rifle, the others spinning wild-eyed. Next one drops a man. James called, voice flat as iron, carrying on the wind. Canyon's wired. Step forward, you lose a leg. They froze, heads jerking toward the ridge, trying to pin his voice. One spat a curse. Another barked a laugh that sounded thin, like a man bluffing his own fear. You alone up there, old soldier? You think you scare us? James chambered another round, aimed low this time, and fired. The bullet smashed into the ground at the boots of the loud one, kicking dust and stone so hard the man stumbled back with a yell. You want to find out? James said. His heart hammered steady now, not fast, like it always did when he locked into a line he couldn't step back from. You take another inch, you find out. For a long breath, no one moved. Then the one with the Henry swore under his breath and yanked the reins of his horse, swinging into the saddle. The others followed, muttering, spitting in the dust like it meant something. James watched them ride out in a ragged line, their curses trailing until the wind ate the sound. He didn't lower the rifle until they were no more than dots on the flat. When the last hoofbeat faded, he sat back hard against the rock, the cold cutting through his coat, his hands shaking though not from fear. From a knowledge of what almost was and what still might be. Men like that didn't quit easy. They'd be back with more or worse. James stayed in the rocks a long time, scanning every line of the horizon. When the silence felt whole again, he rose, rifle slung, and limped back toward the station. He had decisions to make now, fast ones, because if those women were still down there, hiding in some crack of stone, they weren't safe. Not yet, and damn him, but he couldn't leave them to whatever hell those men had in mind. By midday, the wind had dropped, leaving the canyon floor heavy with stillness. James Cutter stood outside the way station, the Henry rifle across his forearms, eyes fixed on the split in the rock that hid the women he had seen the day before. He had turned the decision over 100 ways since sunup, chewing on hard facts like dry leather. If those outlaws came back, and they would, the women in that canyon had no chance. Not with children on their backs and nothing in their hands but sticks and blades of bone. He could stay clear, close his door, and tell himself it wasn't his fight. But the truth was simple and sharp. If he did nothing and blood ran in that canyon, he'd see it in his sleep until the day they laid him in the dirt. He tied his horse, a roan gelding gone gray around the muzzle, and packed light, water-gourd knife, a pouch of ground coffee, and the rifle slung low. His leg burned from the climb as he took the upper trail, breath tight in his chest, sweat running cold down his back even with the sun low and pale. He moved careful, eyes cutting every ridge and hollow, ears tuned for the tick of stone under boots. Nothing, just the scrape of his own breath and the far-off cry of a hawk. The split in the rock came sudden, a narrow gash between high walls. Brush had been dragged across the mouth to make it look like nothing but deadfall, but James saw the hand in it, the way the limbs crossed too neat. He paused, felt the weight of what he was about to do settle deep, then pushed through slow, both hands clear the rifle. What lay beyond hit him quiet and hard. A hollow wide enough for a handful of shelters, low frames of poles, and deer hide patched with bark. Smoke curled thin from a pit fire, its glow dulled to coals. Two children crouched near it, eyes big as coins, their hands clutching a rabbit skinned down to bone. Three women stood close behind them, still as posts, faces drawn tight. No one moved until a fourth figure stepped out from the far shadow. She walked without hurry, her back straight, the braid falling heavy over one shoulder. The dress she wore was cut from old hide worn soft, torn low at the neckline where the stitching had long since given up. A turquoise pendant rested against her chest, pale blue against bronze skin. Her eyes were black, level, and they didn't flinch. James stopped 10 paces out, palms open where they could see. "Name's Cutter," he said, voice even. "I'm not here to take anything. Just came to tell you, those men from this morning won't stay gone. They'll circle back." The oldest woman stepped forward first. Her hair was iron gray, her cheeks cut deep with lines, but her shoulders still held strength. She spoke in Apache first, low and sharp, then again in broken English. "You shoot at them?" "I shot the rock," James said. "They got the message." For now. The older woman's eyes stayed on his, weighing him like a piece of iron at a trade. Then she nodded once, slow, as if filing something away. "Why you care?" James worked his jaw before answering. "Because I've seen what men like that do. Because you've got kids here." He let his gaze shift to the small boy clinging to her skirt, then back to her face. "And because nobody else is coming." The younger one, the one with the braid, spoke then, her voice softer than he expected, but carrying a kind of edge that cut through the quiet. "If no one else comes, why do you?" James met her eyes, and for a second the words stuck. He could have told her the truth, that he was tired of burying faces he saw too late to save, that every bad thing he'd turned away from had carved another hollow in him. But he just said, "Because I can." The old woman studied him a moment longer, then motioned with her chin. "Sit." He lowered himself by the fire, the warmth creeping into his knees. The children kept their eyes locked on him, wide and dark, their thin arms hugging the rabbit close like it might vanish. James slid the pouch of coffee from his belt and set it on the ground between them. "For the pot," he said. No one reached for it, but the old woman's gaze flicked down to it and back up. The younger one, Ahiona, he would learn later, knelt by the fire, her hands moving quick and sure as she split the rabbit and laid the meat on a flat rock near the coals. When she leaned forward, the torn neckline of her dress fell loose, and James dragged his eyes away hard enough to feel the strain in his neck. He busied himself checking the rifle, running a cloth along the barrel like it mattered. He felt their eyes on him while he worked, measuring the set of his shoulders, the angle of his hands. He knew what they were asking without words. Is this man danger or defense? When the meat began to hiss, the old woman spoke again. "Men come back, you fight them." James looked up steady. "If they come back, I stop them." A pause stretched out, the only sound the pop of sap in the fire and the low rush of wind over the canyon rim. Then the old woman gave a single nod. Not trust, not yet, but something close enough to let him stay sitting. James sat there in the smoke glow, the heat working into his palms, and felt the weight of the choice settle deeper. He wasn't leaving this hollow. Not tonight, maybe not ever. And when his eyes flicked to Ahiona again, catching the way the fire carved light along her cheek and down the smooth line of her throat, he knew this wasn't just about a fight anymore. It was about a thing he hadn't thought he'd have again, and that scared him more than any gun pointed his way. The night passed without trouble, but James Cutter slept light on his bedroll by the fire, rifle within reach. Each time the wind hissed across the canyon rim, he opened his eyes, scanning the shadows for a shape that didn't belong. None came. What did come were thoughts he couldn't shake. Faces from the war, faces from years riding with scouts, faces of women and children he hadn't saved because orders said hold your ground. He wondered if that was what drove him here now, into this canyon that wasn't his, among people who had no reason to trust him. At first light, voices stirred near the shelters. Low tones, the crack of sticks breaking for the fire, the soft cough of child. James sat up slow, rolled his shoulders, and caught Ahiona by the pit fire, coaxing the last coals alive. Her hair was loose from its braid, falling heavy down her back, catching the glow like black rope. The deerskin dress she wore still clung where it had worn thin, torn low at the neckline so that when she bent to feed the fire, the smooth plane of her collarbone showed clear in the gray light. He dragged his eyes away, jaw tight, and reached for the tin cup by his side. The old woman spoke to him when the smoke began to rise. "Water low," she said, pointing to two clay jars near the wall of rock, their mouths dry. She looked at him hard, as if waiting to see whether he'd argue. "I'll bring some," James said. He stood, slinging the gourd over his shoulder. When he reached for the second jar, a smaller pair of hands gripped it first. Ahiona. She lifted the weight without strain, her dark eyes fixed on his, calm but measuring. "Pool is half-mile," she said. Her voice carried that soft edge again, the kind that didn't beg and didn't bend. James nodded once. "Then we'd better go." They left the camp together, moving along the narrow canyon path where the walls pressed close. Brush rasped against his coat, the smell of damp earth rising under the morning chill. The trail dipped and twisted, forcing them into tight spaces where their shoulders brushed, her arm grazing his sleeve. Every time it happened, he felt the warmth through the worn fabric like a spark. He kept his eyes forward, but his body knew every line of hers, the curve of her hip when she shifted the jar, the way her breath hitched only when the rocks scraped her bare shin. Halfway down, she stopped and turned to him. "Why you stay?" she asked. No softness now. A blade of a question. James drew a breath that felt heavier than it should. Because I'll come back, he said. And because you don't have rifles. You don't have. He cut himself short. Men, she finished for him. Her mouth barely moved, but her eyes held his, steady as stone. James worked his jaw. That's not what I meant. She looked at him another beat, then shifted the jar higher on her hip and started walking. He followed. The silence between them stretched tight. When they reached the pool, the water lay still and black under an overhang of stone, thin reeds trailing in the breeze. Ahiona crouched first, dipping the jar until it filled with a hollow gurgle. When she bent, the neckline of her dress fell wide, the firelight memory now alive in the clear day, and James turned away hard, staring at the ripples breaking across the surface. He told himself to keep his head, to keep this simple, water, then back to camp, but his pulse didn't listen. When it was his turn, he knelt, boots sinking in the damp clay. The weight of her gaze pressed on him, though she said nothing. He could feel it, felt it like a hand between his shoulders. He filled the gourd slow, his scarred knuckles pale in the cold water. On the climb back, the path narrowed more, forcing them into a gap so tight their bodies slid close, his chest brushing her shoulder. The jar tilted in her hands, and he reached without thinking, steadying it with one big palm over hers. Her skin was warm, the bones of her hand fine under his rough grip. For a long second, neither moved. Her eyes met his dark, unblinking, and his breath caught before he eased back, letting go like it burned. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but the air between them felt different, charged, alive. When they came into the hollow, the old woman's eyes flicked from Ahiona to James, sharp as a hawk's. She said nothing, just took the jar and poured it into the clay cistern. James set the gourd down and stepped back, every muscle tight as a pulled rope. That night, while the camp ate, James sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, watching the canyon mouth. But his mind kept circling the same point, the feel of her hand under his, the way she hadn't pulled away. He told himself it meant nothing. He knew better. The wind came down softer that morning, warm with a hint of dust from the flats. James' cutter rose from his bedroll before the sun cleared the canyon rim. The fire burned down to pale ash. He stretched the stiffness from his back and checked the rifle laid across his blanket. The metal felt cool against his palm, the weight steady. He hoped it wouldn't need to speak today. The camp was already stirring. A thin line of smoke curled from the pit, and two boys crouched near a tangle of saplings, fumbling with snare wire. James watched them a moment, then stepped closer. Both boys froze, eyes flicking to his belt as if expecting trouble. He crouched without a word, took the wire from the older one, and twisted it into a clean loop with a short tail. Then he held it out so they could see the angle, the twist. Not tight, he said, his voice calm low. Let's slip easy. Rabbit fights hard when it feels a bite. The older boy's brow furrowed, but his hands copied the motion. James gave a short nod, then set the snare at the brush edge where fresh tracks marked the dust. By the time he stood, the younger boy was grinning faint, his fear cracked at the edges. James didn't smile back, but something loosened in him all the same. Work filled the next hours. Good work, quiet work. He fetched poles from the slope and laid them across two shelter frames, lashing them tight with strips of rawhide. He shaved cedar for kindling and patched a hole in the lean-to roof with bark and mud. Every time his knee screamed, he gritted his teeth and kept moving because the camp needed more than coffee and warning shots. Ahiona moved through it all like a shadow that carried light. She ground mesquite pods with a stone, the muscles in her arms flexing smooth under bronze skin. She checked the meat drying on the rack, fed a child, mended the frayed hem of her dress while leaving the neckline as it was, low, torn, a defiance or a habit. James couldn't tell which. Once, when he passed her near the fire, her braid brushed his sleeve. He felt it like a brand. Near midday, she came to him without a word and held out something small, a strip of leather threaded with blue beads. It glinted soft in the sun, worn but whole. James looked at it, then at her, searching for meaning. "For your wrist," she said. Her voice carried no heat, no tease, just fact. He took it slow, the pads of his fingers grazing hers as he looped it once, twice, and tied it snug. The beads were cool against his skin, lighter than they looked, but the weight of the gesture settled heavy. "Thank you," he said, the words rougher than they should have been. Ahiona gave a small nod and turned back to the fire, her braids swinging against her spine. James watched her walk away, then looked down at the beads again, wondering when a man stopped being a stranger and started being something else. By late day, the sky turned the color of old brass, the light cutting hard along the canyon rim. James left the camp and climbed to the ridge where he'd stood 2 mornings before, the Henry across his back. He dropped to one knee in the scrub and scanned the flats through the scope, his breath slow and even. That was when he saw them. Tracks first, deep cuts in the dust leading west to east, fresh as spilled water. Then a smudge of movement far out where the land dipped, a dark shape on the rise, a rider turning slow like a man searching. Another followed, then 2 more. James felt the back of his neck go tight. 6 men before. Could be more now. He stayed low until the shapes slid out of sight, then eased back down the slope, his jaw locked hard enough to ache. When he stepped into the hollow, the old woman read it in his face before he spoke. "They come. They're looking," James said. His voice carried no tremor, but inside his gut was a knot of cold iron. Not yet, but soon. Ahiona stood behind the old woman, the firelight catching in her eyes. For the first time, James thought he saw something there that wasn't mistrust. It wasn't fear either. It was the quiet, steady knowledge that when the time came, he'd stand. And for reasons he didn't want to put into words, that mattered more than anything. By nightfall, the canyon burned low with the red glow of the fire, smoke twisting into the dark above the rock walls. James Cutter sat cross-legged near the edge of the circle, his rifle laid across his knees. His eyes kept drifting to the canyon mouth, to the strip of shadow that led to open ground, to the tracks he'd seen hours before. Every part of him was wired tight, ears tuned for hoofbeats, hands ready to move, but the only sounds were the crack of wood and the soft voices of women speaking Apache near the shelters. He felt their eyes now and then, weighing him the way a man weighs the sky for storm signs. Since he came down from the ridge, word had spread. The men were close. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tonight. He had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that stayed quiet because noise wastes breath. The old woman came first, the one the others called grandmother. Her back was straight, though the years sat heavy in her hair, and her eyes carried the weight of command. 2 others followed, younger but still sharp, each with their arms folded across their chests. They stopped before him, the fire throwing their shadows long across the sand. "You know what they want," the old woman said in English rough as gravel. Not a question. James met her gaze. "I know. You fight them. If they come here, yes." He didn't blink, didn't soften it. "If they push, I stop them." The second woman stepped closer, her eyes narrow, voice clipped. "Why? You're not Apache. You have no blood here. No wife here. Why risk dying?" James let the words hang a moment, then drew a slow breath. "Because I've done enough watching in my life," he said. His voice stayed low, steady, but each word carried weight. "Men like that, what they plan, I've seen it. I've seen what happens when no one steps in. I can't stomach it again." The old woman studied him in silence, the firelight deepening the lines on her face. When she spoke, it was softer but no less sharp. "If you stay, you take our law. You give no orders. You eat what we eat. You sleep where we say. You fight when we tell." "That's fair," James said. His jaw worked once, but he nodded. "I'll take it." From the edge of the firelight, Ahiona stepped forward. She hadn't spoken during any of it, just stood with her braid loose over one shoulder, her eyes dark and fixed on him. Now she knelt and set a hand on the packed earth, palm flat. "If he stays," she said in her tongue first, then English, "he stays as kin." The old woman gave a single nod, slow and final. "Then it is done." She turned and walked away without another word, the others following. James sat still, feeling the weight of what had just shifted settle in his bones. Kin, a word that cut deeper than he expected. He wasn't sure what it meant here. Not yet, but it felt like a door closing behind him. When the circle broke and the camp thinned to murmurs and shadows, Ahiona stayed. She crossed to him and lowered herself on her knees, close enough that the heat of her body cut through the night chill. For a while she said nothing, just watched the flames curl and break. Then her voice came quiet. "You tell truth tonight." James turned his head slightly. Wouldn't do much good to lie. She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not mistrust, not sharpness, but something that pulled at him deep. "Most men lie easy," she said. He didn't answer, because there was nothing worth saying to that. Not when her gaze held his the way it did now. When she reached for his hand, it startled him more than any rifle crack could have. Her fingers slid over his knuckles, warm, sure, the calluses meeting his own. She didn't speak when she leaned in, didn't ask. Her mouth brushed his first, soft but certain, and every muscle in him locked tight before giving way. He kissed her back, slow, careful at first, then deeper when her hand gripped the front of his shirt and held him there like she'd waited 10 years for this. When they broke, their foreheads stayed close, breaths mingling in the smoke. James kept his eyes shut a moment, steadying himself, then opened them to find hers still on him. No fear, no regret. "Good night," she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Then she rose and slipped into the dark toward her shelter, leaving him with the taste of her lips and the slow pound of his own pulse. James sat there a long while, the rifle across his knees, staring at the canyon mouth with a mind clear on one thing only. He'd kill any man who tried to cross that firelight. Dawn came gray and cold, pressing a thin mist into the canyon floor. James Cutter stood before the fire with a strip of dried meat between his teeth, his rifle slung and his eyes on the rim. Sleep had been shallow, broken by every shift of wind. Ahiona's kiss still burned in his mind, a thing that both steadied him and cut him open. It was more than one now. It was a line he couldn't turn back from. He spent the first hour walking the canyon edge, boots grinding on stone, scanning every line of earth beyond. He didn't like what he found. Tracks double back near the wash. Fresh, deep, more riders than before. He crouched over one print, ran a finger along the sharp heel edge, and counted 6. No, 7 horses at least. And weight behind the cuts. Packs. Rope. James rose with his jaw tight, every muscle wired. By the time he came down into the hollow, the camp was awake. Women stirred pots over low fires. Children crouched near the embers, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The old woman met him near the shelters, her face unreadable. "They're close," he said, his voice flat. "A day, maybe less." She didn't flinch, just nodded once. "Then you make ready." That was all. No plea, no panic. Just a simple truth laid bare. James respected it more than any promise. He worked fast, stripped juniper limbs for a barricade at the narrow pass, dragged stones into a choke point that would force riders single file. Each pull sent fire through his bad knee, but he gritted down, sweat cutting cold tracks across his temples. The boys helped where they could, their small hands carrying rocks and brush. James showed them where to stack the piles, how to leave gaps that could take a man off a horse if he rushed blind. By noon, his shirt was soaked through, the skin of his palms split from rope burns. He wiped grit from his face and turned to find Ahiona standing behind him, a clay jar cradled in her arms. She offered it without a word, water cold enough to bite his throat. He drank deep, let it spill down his chin, then met her eyes. "You don't have to stand here," he said. "It's not going to be pretty when they come." Her jaw lifted just a fraction. "I stand," she said. Nothing more. James felt something in him shift then, hard and certain. She wasn't leaving. None of them were. And if he fell here, it wouldn't be alone. When the work was done, the canyon lay changed. The path was a wall of brush and stone, every gap set for a rifle line. He showed the older boys where to run if shooting started, how to pull the smallest children into the back hollow. They listened wide-eyed, silent as stone. Night came fast under the high walls, shadows pooling deep. James checked the rifle one last time, slid 6 rounds in the magazine, and laid it across his knees. He sat by the fire because the fire drew him in and fear liked warmth. Ahiona came when the others slept, her steps quiet on the packed earth. She lowered herself beside him, the firelight painting her face in amber and shadow. "You think they come tonight?" she asked, voice barely above the crack of the coals. "Could be," James said. He kept his eyes on the dark mouth of the canyon, where the night seemed thicker than it should. Ahiona's gaze followed his, then slid back. "If you fall, we fight still." He turned to her at that, something hot in his chest. "You won't fall," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." She studied him, her face steady, and then her hand found his, calloused fingers sliding over his knuckles, holding firm. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped, sending sparks into the black, and the quiet between them carried more weight than any vow. When she leaned in, it wasn't quick, wasn't soft. Her lips met his like a question she already knew the answer to, and his hand rose to her jaw, rough thumb brushing the line of her cheek. The kiss deepened slow, pulling heat from places he thought had gone cold for good. When they broke, she stayed close, her breath warm against his skin. "Stay alive," she whispered. "I plan to," he said, though his voice was low, tight because plans didn't mean a damn thing when lead started flying. She left him then, slipping into the dark where the shelters lay. James watched her go, then turned back to the canyon mouth, the weight of the rifle solid in his hands. The wind had stilled, too still, and every instinct in him screamed the same truth. The fight wasn't days away anymore. It was coming with the next sound of hoofbeats. And when it came, he'd meet it head on. The first sound came just before dawn, a single crack of stone rolling down the canyon wall. James Cutter's eyes opened to blackness, his body already moving before thought caught up. He pushed up from the bedroll, cold air cutting his lungs, and reached for the Henry rifle. The fire was down to embers, the camp a hush of shadow and breath. He didn't call out. Noise would waste time. He moved to the barricade he'd built the day before, boots grinding on the packed earth, every muscle taut as wire. The pass beyond the brush lay in darkness, but the air felt wrong, too heavy. Then he heard it, the soft thud of hooves on dirt, muffled voices carrying low. He counted 3, then 5, then more. 7 at least, same as yesterday's tracks. Maybe more now. James sank to a knee behind the stone wall, thumbed the hammer back, and eased a breath through his teeth. This was it. No more waiting. The first rider showed as a shape in the gray, easing his horse through the choke point with his carbine angled across the saddle. Another followed, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. James let them come 2 lengths closer, just far enough that their boots scraped the rock. Then he fired. The shot cracked the canyon open, echo slamming back from the walls. The lead horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider into the dust. Before the others could find their bearings, James racked the lever, fired again, and saw the second man pitch sideways with a grunt. Chaos broke like a dam, shouts, curses, hooves pounding as the men fanned out, blind in the half-light. Behind him the camp woke in a rush of sound. Women pulling children into the hollow, the old woman barking orders in Apache. 2 boys darted to the barricade with stones in their hands, faces pale but set. James waved them back hard. "Stay down," he growled, eyes never leaving the pass. A slug slammed into the rock by his shoulder, throwing grit into his face. James ducked, spat blood where a chip had cut his lip, and shifted left. He counted 3 men now hugging the walls, trying to flank. Another bullet whined past his ear. He took the one on the right, squeezed, saw him drop hard and stay down. Then pain hit like a hammer. His bad leg buckled, a hot spike tearing through the muscle above his knee. James went down hard, the rifle slipping before he clawed it back. He dragged himself behind the barricade, breath tearing, vision tunneling in and out. Footsteps pounded close, too close. A man came through the gap with a pistol raised, face twisted, a snarl ripping out of his throat. James didn't think. He rolled to his side and fired from the ground, the muzzle flash painting the dark white for a blink. The man folded, crashing against the stones. Voices rose outside, angry, shaken, but pulling back. James heard a whistle cut the air, sharp and hard. Hoofbeats thundered after it, fading toward the flats. Gone. For now. He lay still a long moment, chest heaving, the smell of powder thick in his nose. Then a shadow fell across him. Ahiona dropped to her knees, her hands on his face first, then pressing down hard on his thigh where blood pumped hot between her fingers. Her voice came in a low rush, half English, half Apache, fierce and trembling all at once. "Don't talk," she said when he tried. "Don't move." James let his head fall back, jaw clenched against the pain, eyes locked on hers. She was bareheaded, hair loose and wild, the firelight and dawn breaking across her skin. In that moment he thought if death took him now, this sight would be enough to carry into whatever came next. But he wasn't ready to go. Not with her hands on him like that. Not when the word kin still echoed from last night, like a promise not yet finished. Behind her, the old woman barked for cloth. 2 more women ran with a strip of hide and a pot of boiled water. Ahiona didn't look away as she tied the tourniquet tight, her fingers slick and sure. James gritted his teeth until the stars cleared from his eyes. When the bleeding slowed, she bent close, her breath warm against his ear. "You still breathe," she whispered. Good. He wanted to tell her something, maybe everything, but all he managed was a rasp of her name before the weight of the fight dragged him under into black. James Cutter woke to the smell of smoke and the muted hum of voices, his head heavy, his leg burning like iron fresh from the forge. For a moment, he didn't know where he was, only the weight of the blanket over him and the press of rough earth under his back. Then it came back sharp, the canyon, the gunfire, the man with the pistol. He shifted, a groan breaking out before he could bite it down. "Don't move," a voice said, soft but firm. "Ahiona." She knelt beside him, hair loose down her back, eyes dark and steady in the glow of the rekindled fire. Her hands were quick, checking the tourniquet, the bandage tied tight above his knee. Dried blood streaked her arms to the elbow, but her fingers never trembled. Still breathing, James rasped. His throat felt lined with dust. "For now," she said, and there was the smallest curve at the edge of her mouth, something that almost looked like relief but didn't linger. He pushed up on one elbow, sweat breaking cold across his neck. "The men, gone," she said. "2 dead. The rest ran east." Her eyes flicked toward the canyon mouth. "They won't come back." James let out a slow breath, every rib aching. "Good." His gaze found hers again, and for a long moment neither spoke. The weight of what almost was hung between them like smoke. The old woman approached then, her steps silent, her face a mask of stone. She crouched low, studying James with a look that held both judgment and something else, something he couldn't name. When she spoke, her words were plain. "You fight when you could run. You bleed for us. Now you stay." James nodded once, jaw tight. "I'll stay." The old woman gave a single nod, sharp as the crack of a stick, then turned away without ceremony. But James felt what it meant, felt it settle like the ground under his boots after too many miles drifting. When the camp quieted and the others drifted to their shelters, Ahiona stayed by the fire, her knees drawn up, the heat painting her skin in gold and shadow. James watched her through the haze of pain and smoke, every breath hitching with something deeper than the wound. She looked at him then, and whatever wall had stood between them these past days was gone. She rose without a sound and came to him, lowering herself beside his blanket. For a long time neither moved, neither spoke. Then her hand found his slow, certain, sliding over his calloused knuckles. His breath shook when she leaned close, her forehead resting against his, her hair falling around them like a curtain that shut the world out. "I thought you'd die," she whispered. "Not yet," he said, voice raw. "Not with you here." Her lips brushed his then, soft at first, then deeper when his arm pulled her in, rough fingers tangling in the silk of her braid. The kiss carried the weight of every silent moment between them, every glance, every brush of hands. And when it broke, she stayed against his chest, her breath warm through the torn fabric of his shirt. They spoke no vows. None were needed. In the language of this canyon, a man didn't stay for words. He stayed for what he'd bled to keep. By dawn, the sky above the rim burned pale and clean. The canyon smelled of smoke and earth, but the weight of fear had broken. James sat propped against the rock, Ahiona beside him, her fingers laced with his as the first light spilled across the shelters. Children laughed somewhere near the fire, a sound sharp and bright against the hush. James looked out at the pass where blood still darkened the dust, then at the woman who had bound his wound and held him through the dark. "It's over," he said, though part of him knew it was just beginning. She turned her face to his, eyes steady. "No," she said. "It starts now." He smiled then, a small, rough thing that felt strange on his mouth, and closed his fingers around hers like a man anchoring to solid ground. The wind came down soft, carrying no hoofbeats, no threat. Only the smell of cedar smoke and the low hum of voices in a place where he was no longer a stranger. James Cutter had stayed, and he wasn't leaving again.